Welcome back to the Personal Finance Project. Today, we're going to do another segment of the book club, and we're going to continue working through Christine Benz's wonderful book called How to Retire. And this is, again, that book where she interviewed, I think it was 20 experts, including herself, and they are walking us through how we can retire, and not just retire and not run out of money, but how to retire and use our money in order to enrich our lives in that last phase of life. So today she sat down with, or I read the chapter where she sat down with Wade Pfau. If you're in the business, Wade is a pretty common name. He's done a lot of research on how to best produce retirement income for essentially various time periods, how much risk you can take in retirement, what an actual safe withdrawal rate is subject to the constraints of what the equity markets might do or what history tells us they might do, how much a person might need to spend, what kind of bands you can put around your portfolio in order to make yourself feel a little bit more comfortable. So Wade is a phenomenal resource. He's written many books of his own, and I would recommend anybody read those. But really what the conversation centered around with Wade was defining what your retirement income style should be. And essentially, this is a method by which your practitioner, your advisor, and the client, or you, the listener, can go through and figure out what method of investment in order to produce the income that you need to spend in retirement is most suitable given your particular constitution. And so the way that I thought about this was in a couple of realms. And I thought, as a financial advisor, it isn't enough to just assure a client that their spending methodology or investment methodology is sufficient for them not to run out of money. Okay, that's certainly a necessary precondition for retirement, but I thought about it and I realized it's not sufficient, because the manner by which you actually spend down that money, or the manner by which you do not run out of money, matters a whole lot. Because if you are getting close to just a subsistence level, your behaviors are going to be modified based on that reality. And what I mean by that is, if we are really fully amortizing your portfolio over a 30-year retirement to where, as some people like to say, the last check you write is a hot check, that's really a tongue-in-cheek approach, because no human being is ever actually going to draw their assets down to that level and do so comfortably. So it isn't enough just to assure a retiree that they're not going to run out of money. We need to make sure that we do so, or that we spend money in a way that makes them feel very comforted by their portfolio, which will allow them to continue to do the things they want to do in retirement, free from anxiety. So Christine's first question is, why define your retirement income style? And Wade says, there are different approaches to retirement. There are investment-based approaches, which he'll get into. There are bucketing approaches, which we covered on a previous podcast, actually the chapter that Christine interviewed herself on. There are income flooring approaches. That's where he's going to get into some guaranteed streams of income in addition to Social Security. And that would be where you build a protected lifetime income. And then he says there's just so much disagreement about them and which one is the best. Ultimately, there's a role for different strategies based on what makes someone most comfortable for their retirement. And that, while it's definitely more of a qualitative rather than quantitative measure, is perhaps the most important, is how comfortable are you spending money in retirement? And your income production style or your investment style should really be geared toward making you most comfortable, as long as you're not doing anything or exposing yourself to an inordinate risk along any particular dimension. It's very important that you feel comforted by your portfolio so that you can continue doing the things you want to do. And Wade would second that. And so it says, but there's never been a framework to help someone choose a particular strategy. Usually if a consumer is learning about retirement, they're hearing about it from an advocate of one particular style. And that advocate might not even acknowledge that other income styles exist. So the whole idea was to develop an assessment tool to help individuals find a firm starting point from which to make their retirement plans. Now, Wade actually has a sort of questionnaire that a person can go through, and that might give us an indication as to what their income style or preference for style might be. However, I would caution that taking the results of a survey to be dispositive is probably not the right direction to go. And the reason I say that is, and I think this was a famous David Ogilvy quote, which said, they don't think what they feel, they don't say what they think, and they certainly don't do what they say. That's certainly true in our business, where people might indicate that they are more risk-seeking than their behavior would indicate. So they might have some express preferences, and those express preferences in many instances contravene their revealed preferences, which is when markets get tough, they get real anxious about their portfolio. And if you're really a risk-seeking investor, when markets get tough, that should be when you thrive, because you're thinking, I'm glad that there is volatility, because volatility typically means I'm getting higher returns over a longer period of time. However, if you get anxious and you stop spending money, it's clear that you're probably not well suited for a portfolio that's that volatile. So I would caution the results of a survey or results of a questionnaire, because they can often be in contradiction with how a person actually behaves, which is really what I'm more interested in. However, it's a great starting point. And so Wade says, we've identified two key areas where retirees might differ on their retirement income preferences. The first is their attitude towards safety of their income stream. Do they have a safety first mindset, or are they probability oriented? Now, probability oriented is essentially just you're very happy to capture equity risk premiums over a long period of time, knowing that you're going to get a lot of volatility along the way, but you know that the probability of having a higher portfolio or a more valuable portfolio 10 or 15 years from now is very good. It rests in the favor of the investor. History tells us that that's the case. That's not me saying that you're always going to have great results over a 10 or 15-year period. I'm just saying that the probability of that being the case rests in the favor of the investor. Now, so the first area is, do they want a guaranteed or predictable income stream, or are they more probability-based? And then the second key area relates to whether or not they're willing to commit to a single retirement income strategy, or if they prefer some optionality to make more adjustments along the way. We use these four variables in order to essentially create the assessment. So they go on, and the first key area that they want to assess on a retiree is whether or not they are probability-based or if they are safety first. And so Christine says, let's start with the first key question. Pre-retirees need to consider whether they prefer a probability-based or a safety-first approach. Can you talk about what safety first means in the context of retirement income, as well as what a probability-based approach would entail? I would guess that having comfort with market risk is important with a probability-based approach. And Wade is going to reveal just that. So a safety first, and we've touched on this many times, mostly because I'm very curious as to what products are purported to do, but what it is that they actually do and what influence a specific product might have on the behavior of the person who has bought that product, even if they bought it thinking it was going to do something else for them entirely. And the best example I have of that, something I've talked about before, and this is not a recommendation, is the power of an annuity in a portfolio. And so if you're a safety first investor, you're probably very well disposed to owning an annuity. Now, a lot of people, they don't like annuities, the A word, so to speak. And that's because these have a history of being products that are very opaque, difficult to understand, very expensive, and that pay the salespeople very high commissions, which obviously can incentivize them to sell it, even if it isn't suitable for the client. Now, I'm not saying that there's a lot of people out there doing that. I'm just telling you where the incentives rest. However, if we can look past those fairly substantial hurdles, and I'm not saying that there aren't any problems with annuities, certainly there are, I like to examine how it is that people feel and act once they are the beneficial owner of that annuity. And the data on this are fairly clear. JP Morgan did a big study of households that own an annuity. Other asset managers have done these studies. Obviously, their biases are clear. But as it turns out, and this is a data point that I've referenced before, retirees who own annuities, they typically spend a little bit more money than their retirees who do not own annuities. But most importantly, from my perspective, they feel better about their spending. And I imagine what they mean by that is they don't demonstrate, or there is an absence of negative emotion with regards to their portfolio and their income as compared to their peers who don't have an annuity. And that kind of makes sense to me, because if you're in retirement, you actually fear running out of money more than you fear death itself. So what that means is you would rather be the person in a very fancy casket than the person living in the upstairs apartment at your, say, son-in-law's house. I can grant that that's a fear. And so the annuity, which is a stream of income that says, granted subject to the risks of your counterparty, for the rest of your life, we are going to pay you the stream of income. You will never be destitute. We'll leave inflation out of this example for now, because you're always, no matter what, again, your counterparty could technically default, but just bear with me here, going to have the stream of income. And that would likely be in addition to what you're getting from Social Security, And so what a lot of people love to do when they take this sort of method of income production is they find out what their core expenses are. And these are really the expenses, or the keep the lights on expenses. This is your water, your gas, your groceries, your housing, your utilities, that kind of thing. And they really like to cover that with a source of guaranteed income, because then they know, hey, at the very least, the bank's not going to take our house. The lights aren't going to be shut off. We're still going to have natural gas. We're going to be able to feed and clothe ourselves. And that gives people peace of mind. And I really feel like if you want to encourage people to do anything, like if you want to encourage people to explore the oceans, or if you want to encourage people to build ships, you really need to advertise the vastness of the ocean and saying, look at all that out there that's left to be explored. Wouldn't that be wonderful? What do we need to do in order to do that? Let's build the ships. So if you're saying, what does peace of mind look like for you? If peace of mind looks like owning part of your portfolio in an annuity, talk about it. Just explore it. So no, that was a little bit of a tangent, but that's what Wade's going to get into with safety first. Probability-based is saying, no, I'm not comfortable turning over a big chunk of my capital to an insurance company. Because remember, for many plain vanilla annuities, you do a single payment immediate annuity. What that means is you pay a big premium that immediately starts a lifetime income stream. However, you have now turned that principal value over to the insurance company. And in most cases, or in some cases, you're not going to get it back. Some products are a little bit fancier than others. They have a death benefit or other ways in which your beneficiaries might get some of that principal value back. But a plain vanilla basic annuity that's just paying you an income stream for the rest of your life, you've turned that capital over. You're not taking risk with it anymore. You've turned it into a predictable income stream. The probability-based people are saying, I don't want to do that. I don't want to turn that much money over to an insurance company, even if it means I get a lifetime income stream. I'm willing to take the risk with my portfolio because I know if I'm a disciplined long-term investor, the probability of this going up over sufficient lengths of time is in my favor. And that's true. It's not a casino like some people on TikTok would like you to believe. The stock market for long periods of time has been the single greatest creator of wealth that we've ever seen. And so probability-based investors are very comforted by that fact. That's not a guarantee. And they don't need income guarantees because they're thinking, if I am patient, I can turn my own capital into a predictive or a predictable stream of income and still not take too much risk with it. I'm just happy to take some risk with it in order to build up that value over time. So that's really the difference between safety first, turning your assets into a contractually based income stream, or probability, saying I'm going to accrue this risk and I'm going to capture those equity risk premiums over a sufficient length of time so that I can grow my capital base. And by that, essentially, if you're growing your capital base over a sufficient length of time, you're de-risking that income stream because you're taking, as a proportion of your portfolio, a smaller and smaller chunk as time goes on. All right. So the other one is optionality versus commitments. And I think in this case, optionality would be more of a probability style because you have total control over the principal value of your assets. You have not turned those assets over to a third party. You're keeping control of those assets, so you make all of the decisions in terms of the investments. You're not turning that into a fixed stream of income, versus a commitment strategy is saying, yes, I've put this money into an annuity. Most annuities have a surrender schedule where you need to keep these things invested 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years before you could surrender it and get your principal value back. However, what that commitment has allowed you to do is to take a lifetime stream of income off of that product. So you have to give up a little optionality in order to have the peace of mind of that fixed stream of income. But if you maintain optionality, you certainly have more options, as the name would suggest, with how you can invest your money. But you have to forego a third party giving you that lifetime income stream. Okay, so they get through all of that, where we're going probability-based or safety first, optionality versus commitment, and they actually get into the retirement income styles. Now, we covered this briefly with Christine Benz's own chapter because she kind of centered on that bucketing approach, but they're going to get into 4 or 3 others because I think they also talk about the bucketing approach. And the first one's probably the most basic. It's just called total return. And so Christine says, you note that a self-assessment of how they feel about all of these factors can help retirees plot themselves in one of the 4 quadrants. So how they feel about safety first versus or versus probability, optionality versus commitment. That's where they're going to get in one of these quadrants. So representing 4 different income styles. Let's examine each of these styles, starting with the total return investing style. What types of investments and strategies are part and parcel of this approach? Now, the total return investing style is probably the most self-explanatory, where you're essentially saying, here's how much risk I'm willing to take with my money. And the risk is probably going to be defined by something like standard deviation or the variance of your portfolio. Whether or not that's a great assessment of risk to the retiree, we can kind of quibble about, because for Scott and I, risk is really just defined by the likelihood that you're going to not have enough money to fund a future obligation. And for a retiree, that basically says, how likely am I to have money in my 80s and 90s to continue my living the lifestyle that I'm going to want to live, whatever it might be at 80 to 90? That's really what Scott and I regard as risk. But these things are really sort of indelibly linked. So Wade says, the total return investing approach is generally the default in the consumer setting because it's the most closely aligned with pre-retirement. That was sort of a fancy way of saying in your pre-retirement days, you're just accumulating money. So you're really just trying to enhance the total return on your portfolio. Risk is sort of a secondary characteristic for you when you have an income that isn't related to your portfolio in most cases, unless maybe you're a fund manager. And so Wade says the default setting is you just continue that investment style right on into retirement. However, as we've talked about before with sequence risk, that can pose some very unique risks of its own because you're far more sensitive to market drawdowns. However, but what Wade is saying is that this style is really just a continuation of what you were doing before. Now, this aligns with the probability-based and optionality preferences. No surprises there. In the pre-retirement world, you build a diversified investment portfolio to grow your wealth. And then at retirement, you just flip a switch. You're no longer adding new savings. You're now taking distributions, but you otherwise use the same sort of diversified investment portfolio, and you develop some sort of systematic withdrawal strategy to spend from the investment portfolio in retirement. So what Wade is saying there is that you're not entirely agnostic to the makeup of the portfolio. You've got a diversified portfolio, stocks, maybe along the way you started to pick up some bonds because you know you're headed into a period of time where you're going to actually need to start taking distributions. But you are really gearing it toward one specific outcome, which is maximizing your total return subject to how much risk you are willing to take. You're not making any real tactical changes with respect to your portfolio now that you're transitioning into retirement. That piece of it doesn't really matter. You're just saying, I've got my 60-40. I had my 60-40. I'm going to keep my 60-40. But rather than putting money into my 60-40, I'm just going to take money out. And he did leave it open here to say you're going to develop some kind of withdrawal strategy. But if you're going to maintain that 60-40, as the listener can probably in tune by now, you're going to be doing some rebalancing over time. So even if you withdrew your income need from the bonds, if the bonds drop to be less than 40% of your portfolio, you would have to sell stocks and refill that bond portion, which in essence is essentially just selling the stocks to take your income. It's the same thing. The other thing that you could do is you could just scrape all of the dividends and interest off of that 60-40 and see if that was sufficient to cover your income needs. And if it wasn't, that plus Social Security, you could then just liquidate a piece of the portfolio from that model in order to fill the gap. However, you would then rebalance that portfolio to true north so that it maintained its return and risk characteristics, probably into perpetuity. Now, Christine says, it seems like a lot of financial advisors naturally gravitate toward the total return approach. Do they do so because it allows them to maintain more fee-generating assets? Now, obviously, the bias of the advisor would be to maintain fee-generating assets. However, advisors are supposed to be acting in the best interest of their clients. So if they have an incentive in order to maintain assets, they do still need to make sure that the makeup of the portfolio is not just suitable, but in the best interest of their client. Here's what Wade says. For advisors who charge based on assets that they manage, there can certainly be a financial incentive to use a total return strategy. Makes sense. More assets under management, more fees. You can see why they'd wish to maintain as many assets as possible in the investment portfolio that they're managing. But part of it is that retirement planning is still a relatively new field within financial services. It's hard to assign it a birth date. You could argue that it only goes back as far as Bill Bengen's research in 1994. And just for the benefit of the listener, Bill was the guy who came up with the 4% safe withdrawal rate rule. So really, the birth of retirement planning does not predate the 1990s. A lot of advisors still don't fully understand the mechanics of what happens when you switch from saving and accumulating into spending from your assets. And I would definitely say that's true, because even though I've been in the business now just a decade, I'm intimately familiar with what's called sequence risk. But sequence risk is something that many of our clients coming into the office have never heard before. They've heard the 4% withdrawal rate. They've certainly heard of the 60-40 portfolio, but many of them are totally ignorant of sequence risk. And like we've talked about before, but that I'll reiterate here, sequence risk is when the order in which you get your returns on your portfolio does not really matter when you are not taking money out. It matters when you are putting money in, and it matters when you are pulling money out a whole heck of a lot, because if you shrink the size of your portfolio, you get to this point where you are subtracting more and more from less and less, especially if you shrink that portfolio early when you have a lot more future cash flows to generate from it. That can put you in a pretty risky position. So Wade is saying, yeah, even in the financial advice space, people haven't really grasped how to invest assets in order to shield or in order to insulate retirees from the pernicious effects of sequence risk. So he goes on, risk really changes in retirement, and advisors who haven't thought through that process naturally gravitate toward the total return style they used when their clients were accumulating. They figure they might as well use the same style when they're distributing from that asset base. Now, this is a bit like saying, yeah, if you reduce calories a little bit, you lose weight. So then obviously you think if I reduce calories even more, I would lose more weight. It doesn't work if you take calories to zero, because if you take calories to zero, you die. And so I think what Wade is saying here is what financial advisors have gotten in the habit of doing is saying, yeah, if we just reduce calories a little bit, we get the intended effect. But what happens when we enter retirement? That is a little bit like reducing calories to zero. You're not going to get the intended effect of that diet or of this portfolio because the context is very different. The risks are very different, and you need to be very mindful of those risks with how you are generating your income and with how your assets are invested. So, Christine says, one central consideration for someone using a total return style is that they have to figure out how much they can safely spend from that total return portfolio each year. You've done a lot of research on that topic. What are your main takeaways when you think about safe withdrawal rates for these people? And Wade says, when Bill Bengen developed the 4% rule, it was a research simplification to say that the spending would always adjust for inflation and not respond at all to market performance. That aspect of it creates the most sequence of returns risk that in turn causes safe withdrawal rate number to be the lowest possible. Okay, that sounded a little bit academic, so let me break it down for you. What Wade is saying is that in order to make financial planning models work, they have to fix some pieces in place, even if we know a priori that those assumptions are totally wrong. And so what Wade is saying is this 4% rule that most people are comfortable with was really developed with a few very unrealistic assumptions in mind in order to make the research possible, okay? And so Wade points out two fundamental flaws. The first of which is spending in retirement will always and forever go up every year by the amount of inflation. The second one is that always and forever, you will behave with perfect fidelity exactly the same no matter what the external environment is doing. 0809, you felt just as sanguine spending your money as you did during some, say, 2020 or say 2018 and 2019. Really good market years, really bad market years. Now, what Wade is alluding to here is that is insane, and that is not the way that ordinary people, actual people who exist outside of the confines of a spreadsheet, will really treat their money when the external environment is in flux. So when the external environment is in flux, as we've seen in our business, people just make different decisions. There are widely available cheaper substitutes that they can move into their lives in order to save some money. People will stop shopping at Whole Foods and start shopping at Kroger. People will postpone a vacation. People will continue to work. People will go back to work. People are going to change their behavior when the context changes. And then the other thing is, there's been a lot of studies on this. I think Vanguard is the primary study on this with retirement spending, where what Vanguard found is on average, and we'll break down what that means here in a second, retirement spending actually came down by about 1% per year over the course of a 30-year period. So it didn't go up by inflation. Certainly, it didn't even stay stagnant. It actually came down in real terms, which could mean it just didn't increase by the amount of inflation per year. Now, average does not mean typical in every case. And so I caution people to say that, yes, you can have some people who are unfortunate to run into very severe end-of-life needs, and they can have some high medical expenses at the end of their life. Now, that would pull the average spend up a little bit. So I think what Vanguard did is they're saying, look, median spend or typical spend is a lot closer to a reduction year over year than it is to an increase by inflation or an increase over time. Even that retirement spending smile that some people talk about, that last end of the smile, that is disproportionately owned by a small group of unfortunate individuals who had very severe illnesses that went through the end of their life. Okay, so sorry for the slight deviation here, but we'll get back to this. Christine then says, can you explain why taking the same amount out of a portfolio adjusted for inflation as a withdrawal approach is a withdrawal approach that's particularly vulnerable to sequence of returns risk? So this is saying if you are always and forever going to take the same amount out of your portfolio, totally independent of the context, totally independent of the markets being in flux, why would that expose you to sequence risk? And so Wade basically says, if you are going to spend the same amount from your total return portfolio when the markets have declined or your portfolio has declined 20%, the effect that will have on your portfolio is outsized dramatically in those down years. Because if you think about it, you're essentially compounding that negative event by your spending. So if the markets were down 20% and you didn't withdraw the money until after the markets had gone down, your total return would have been minus 25%. Now, you had to consume the cash. So you could say, yeah, well, it's not really minus 25% because you got to spend the money, but your portfolio has shrunk much more than it ordinarily would have under more normal conditions. And I think that's what Christine is pointing out. And the most classic case is you invest $1 million, you get a minus 50% return, and then you get a plus 50% return the next year. You are not back to even. You're not even close. You're only up to 3/4 of where you were before, because that 50% return on half of your portfolio is only worth $250,000 at that point. So it only brings you back up to $750,000. You're still down dramatically. And that's really the power of compounding at work, just in the negative direction. So they get into a little bit of how someone might mitigate sequence risk. We touched on this before with the bucketing method, but here's what Wade says. He says there are 4 ways. The first is to spend very conservatively. That's the logic of the 4% rule. Another option is to spend with some flexibility or adapt your lifestyle to the external environment, which is what most people do anyway. A third approach is to mitigate the volatility of the portfolio, not necessarily by just investing in bonds, but with a bucketing approach. And that's really what we touched on in the episode with Christine. Or a rising equity glide path, as your equities are actually going to increase as a proportion of your total portfolio over time because you're spending down your much less volatile, far more predictable bonds, rather than trying to time the market and spend off of your equities in the good years and then reinvest in equities in the bad. And the fourth approach is what he calls buffer assets, where you have something outside the portfolio that you can treat as a temporary spending resource to spend from after market downturns, most common of which is just a cash bucket. So having a year's worth of cash set aside, you're not going to spend that cash in ordinary circumstances. You're going to have to overcome just looking at it, as it does virtually nothing for you in ordinary years. However, what he's saying is, say we get a year like 2022. Stocks and bonds collapse in tandem. So correlations move toward 1. Both stocks and bonds are down. Interest rates were going up. Equity valuations are coming down. Bond prices are coming down. You're kind of in a pickle. Even if you set up a bucketing approach, you're kind of in a pickle because your buckets are bonds and your bonds are not doing very well. So what Wade is saying is you have this external asset that's just held in a safe spot. It's just cash. It's probably not under your mattress. It's probably in a high yield savings account. However, it's not subject to the risks of even the bond market. Saying, yeah, it's going to get eroded by inflation over time. However, it still probably will prove to be a great investment in a year like 2022 when both stocks and bonds come down. So that was the fourth way that you can mitigate sequence risk. Just have something to go to in the event that something bad were to happen. I would caution you, Scott and I just did an episode on gold. A lot of people might think, oh, the asset that I'll put out there on the side is gold. Gold can often be correlated very highly with other asset classes. So I would not suggest owning something that might also decline in value with your other assets. I would probably own something that is not going to provide wonderful returns like cash, but will certainly be a safe haven for you in the event that we have a year like 2022. All right. That was retirement style 1. Total return portfolio. You're kind of agnostic to the mix. All you're saying is I want this amount of return on average, this amount of standard deviation on average, and I'm going to kind of figure out how to withdraw money year over year, but we're going to rebalance to that total return portfolio every year. Retirement income style number 2, which is time segmentation. And so this is probably going to be very much like the bucketing approach we covered with Christine. Another retirement, and so Christine says, another retirement income style is time segmentation. It's often shorthanded as bucketing, which you've mentioned before. What is a time segmentation style, and for whom might that be appropriate? All right. So what Wade is going to say about time segmentation is pretty much word for word a reiteration of what Christine said with her bucketing methodology to retirement, which is you can imagine your retirement as a timeline, right? And so really what a lot of people like to do is they like to do a cash flow matching strategy, which matches the income production of an asset and its risk characteristics to a particular point in time during retirement. So bear with me here. Very short-term cash liabilities, 1 to 5 years. You really don't want to have a lot of volatility with the assets that are going to be funding the next 5 years. Because if you have a lot of volatility, you might be part of the lucky few who ends up with more money over that 5-year period. But what would be very concerning for you is if you're part of a group of people who end up with significantly less money, a bit like Michael Scott when he was 40 as opposed to 30. And so what you want to do is you would want to shield those assets from risk. And what that typically means is you're going to give up some upside, but what you're going to get in return from that is a very predictable or very stable value of those assets. So that first time segment would be your first bucket. And what would very likely compose that bucket is going to be cash and short-term bonds. So you're probably not even going to be taking the risk by extending duration on your bonds, which are very interest rate sensitive. You just want to have something that is going to be insulated from the vagaries of the stock and bond market because you've got some upcoming cash flows. All right, so that would be bucket 1. Bucket 2 might be for expenses that you have between 5 and 10 years or 5 and 12 years, something like that. And in that bucket, you can probably get a little bit more enterprising. You can probably take a little bit more interest rate risk by extending the duration of your bonds. And in most normal environments, those bonds are actually going to pay you a higher coupon for having done so. So you're going to be getting more cash flows off those bonds. You're probably going to be reinvesting those cash flows. And if interest rates come down, you'll benefit a little bit more in the short term because the price of those bonds will go up. And if interest rates go up, and this is a somewhat counterintuitive point, a lot of people think, oh, I got these long duration bonds and interest rates went up. It's like, yeah. However, if you are willing to invest in those bonds for a 10-year period, if interest rates go up, your total return over that 10-year period in that 10-year bond will actually be slightly better than it would have been if interest rates were to go down. Here's why. Your bond returns are in 3 component pieces. Your principal valuation, which if it's guaranteed by the United States government, those things are not going to default on you, so you're going to get your principal back. The other thing is your coupon. If it's a 5% bond, you're going to be clipping $50 a year on that, and you're going to get that money in semi-annual installments every year. So you're going to get your coupon. And the third element, which is often overlooked, is what you can earn on those reinvested coupons. Now, to make bond math easy, the assumption is that is reinvested at the rate that you bought the bond at. But anybody who's been a bond investor these past 5 years knows interest rates don't stay still. They certainly don't stay still for 10 years. So if interest rates go up, you can imagine you've just earned your $50 coupon. Now I can reinvest that coupon and earn a higher yield. So if I hold that 10-year bond to maturity and interest rates have gone up during the life of the bond, my return is going to be a little bit better because I'll get my par value back. I'll collect all of the coupons that I was going to collect, and the coupons would have earned slightly more than they would have had interest rates stayed the same or even gone down. So that's kind of how you're earning the return on those bonds. Makes sense if that's in your 5 to 10, maybe 15-year bucket. And then for things beyond the horizon, so beyond 12 or 15 years, that's really where you can start to take a lot more risk. And by risk, I mean the variability of those assets is going to be much larger than, say, cash and bonds. And the reason is if you give stocks, this is principally what would be in that part of your portfolio, a sufficient runway, so probably 10 or 15 years, more often than not, as history tells us, you're going to have more money over that period. And if you are following or abiding by the rule of 72, if you can earn about a 7% annualized rate of return, slightly lower than the historic average of the S&P 500, over about a 10-year period, you will double that portion of your portfolio. And so, as you can imagine, we're moving along the timeline. We are consuming those pieces of the portfolio that are better suited for those early years first. We're letting the equities compound over time. When you get to 10 or 15 years down the road, you'll have totally eaten up your bond portion, but then you'll have this big asset. You'll have an asset that might, in some cases, be twice as large or even larger than where you started 10 or 15 years ago. And at that point in time, you can assess what it is you want to do with that part of the portfolio. Do you want to leave it in all equities and just spend it down from there? Might work because you don't have as much time left in your retirement now. Or you could convert a piece of that portfolio to fixed income if you're not comfortable having a 100% equity portfolio, and most people wouldn't be. So that's really how he's going to bucket these things in terms of their time segments. Short duration assets cover short-term liabilities, don't take a lot of risk. Middle duration assets covering middle term liabilities, you can take a little bit more risk. So this would be corporate bonds, maybe high yield bonds, maybe like an equity income strategy or sometimes they call it a multi-asset strategy. And then for long term, think growth stocks, value stocks, small cap stocks, international stocks. All of that in a well-diversified mix is probably going to give you the best results over a 15-year period. Okay, so that's kind of time segmenting. Retirement income style 3, income protection. So Christine says, I want to talk about income protection. It seems like the purest expression of that would be just to buy a basic income annuity. Can you talk about what else the income protection style would entail? Wade says, with income protection, it's safety first. You want contractual protections for your core spending and you are commitment oriented. What he's saying there is, you're going to give some money to a third party and they are contractually obligated to pay you a certain rate of income for probably the rest of your life. That's the most common arrangement. There are some other arrangements you can do, but that's the most common arrangement. And so remember, that is a contractual obligation. For them not to pay you would be violating a covenant that they have with you, which could have its own set of legal ramifications. Okay? So that makes those cash flows a little bit more predictable than, say, dividends or interest payments on even corporate bonds. Although interest payments on corporate bonds are also covenants, these are insured payments coming from an insurance provider or an annuity provider. All right. So what Wade says is that means looking at annuities that have the strongest income protections in the worst case market scenarios. That's generally the world of fixed annuities. A fixed annuity just pretty much self-explanatory. It has a fixed rate of interest or a stated rate of interest that it's going to pay you, and it's never going to change. It's not going to adjust for inflation. It's not going to go up if they get great returns on your assets. It's just a fixed payment annuity. Whether it's the simple single premium immediate annuity, that's the one we talked about earlier. You make a big premium payment, they immediately turn that into a cash flow stream for you, or a deferred income annuity. This is where you would give them a big premium. They'd probably invest it for some number of years, and then later you could turn it into a probably larger stream of income. One, because you don't have as many years of income, and two, because they've had the benefit of investing those assets for that period. In many cases, the fixed annuities with lifetime income benefits can provide payout rates that are competitive with simple income annuities. With an income annuity, the purchaser is locked in. It's an irrevocable contract that doesn't give them any flexibility. With the fixed index annuity, sometimes people pay for the lifetime income protections but don't take advantage of them. They don't distribute they don't distribute the fully allowed amount, which means the contract is less likely to deplete. That means the insurance company is less likely to be on the hook to make good on any promised payments. Competition from that can allow for higher payout rates on the fixed indexed annuities. So it's worth someone with an income protection style looking at those products. So a fixed index annuity was essentially going to be an annuity that can change value subject to the value of a particular index that it is pegged to. Sometimes they have caps. So if the S&P 500 goes up 10%, but you have an 8% cap, you're only credited with the first 8% of that performance. And many of them also have floors, which says even if the S&P goes down 10, we're going to keep your principal value at where you started. We're not actually going to penalize you for being in this product. Now, that's not saying that's how all of these products work. You would have to do some research of your own to make sure that that's how that works. But that's how what he's saying here is fixed index annuities can often provide for higher payouts at later dates because you're actually doing some market participation, whereas a single premium immediate annuity that's just fixed, not fixed indexed, is just going to pay you that guaranteed stream of income. Okay, then Christine, and I think this is a really good point, says, can an income protection style involve equities? And Wade says, once you have your basic expenses covered with this protected, reliable type of income source, the rest of the assets can be invested for upside. You can feel more comfortable investing the rest more aggressively, even if the market tanks. You've got this income protection in place and you have your basics covered. You're not exposed to market risk. That's the whole idea of income protection. First, build a floor of protected lifetime income and then invest the rest for upside because you've got more risk capacity. Since you've got your basic spending covered, you can use a variable spending strategy and invest more aggressively in equities for discretionary goals and expenses. And that is really the crux of the annuity argument. That's the argument that I've kept making. I'm sort of agnostic to what people think about, well, how expensive are they and who's selling them and all this other stuff. It's like, it's important for us to analyze that, and you certainly want to go to somebody or a provider that you trust. But I'm way more interested in what the behavioral ramifications are for people who own annuities. And Wade just reiterated point by point everything that I've been saying on this podcast. People with annuities love the feeling of having their basic income needs covered by a contractual source of income. They supplement that in most cases with another contractual source of income, Social Security. And that allows them to actually be counterintuitively a more aggressive investor with the other part of their portfolio, which in many cases can actually mean that people who are more risk averse when it comes to that floor of income end up taking slightly more market risk than their contemporaries who would even regard themselves as more risk seeking. Okay? Because the people with the annuity don't have to allocate a portion of their capital to maybe bonds or cash from which they could withdraw the money every year. They can be maximally aggressive, if they so choose, with that portion of their portfolio that is not in the annuity. And then in up years, they might be able to do some more discretionary spending. They might be able to go on that cruise. They might be able to surprise their family with something. And in the down years, they feel really good. Because they're saying, well, my basic income needs are being met. My lifestyle is being funded by these annuity payments. Yes, they're not adjusting for inflation, but their Social Security is going to do that. And so in many cases, these investors are the happiest retirees on the block because they are very comforted by their basic needs being met by a contractual obligation of a third party who definitely needs to be well vetted, but in many instances is not going to default on those payments. Not ever. Certainly has happened in history, but very unlikely. Okay. So Christine then says, much academic research points to the value of using basic income annuities with an aim of enhancing lifetime income. Yet, people tend not to use them very much. Can you talk about what is called the annuity puzzle, which is that people tend to not buy annuities as often as research from you and others might suggest that they should be doing? And the note that I put in my book here was, there are some a-holes out there who are only going to draw attention to the downsides of annuities. They think that annuity salesmen are greasy. They're just out to earn their commissions. They don't care about their clients. They don't care if the product is suitable. They're not acting in your best interest. They're just out there to get your money, and they don't really care what happens after this initial transaction. I am sure, in fact, I am certain that there are people out there who fit that description, but they are few and far between, and they are on life support, kept alive by certain individuals out in the personal finance space that no matter how compelling the data is for actual human beings who use annuities in their portfolios and how they feel about it, they're like, I don't care what you think, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I have an axe to grind on people who sell annuities. I don't like that they get paid commissions, so therefore, no annuities for you. They bother me because, again, if there is a product out there that can enhance the way that you feel, enhance your happiness, enrich your life by turning some money over to an insurance company that's been well vetted, and perhaps this transaction has been brokered through an advisor with whom you have a relationship, who is not just in a transactional sort of, who's not just transactional with you. It's more enduring than that. You're going to come back to them to get advice on the other parts of your portfolio, and they've included this annuity as part of their advice to you. That seems to insulate people from those sharks out there who really do just want to be paid up front and then to forget about you. But the annuity puzzle really stems from people out there saying no one should ever own an annuity. And it's just not true. So Wade says, I've heard people say that academics hate annuities, but I don't know where that comes from. If you start digging into the literature, you can find that there have been critiques of certain types of annuities and their pricing, totally fair. But in 1965, economists pointed out that if you don't have a legacy goal and you're just trying to efficiently fund a lifetime spending goal over an unknown time horizon, you want to annuitize. This is because risk pooling is the best way to protect that lifetime spending goal. And risk risk pooling is basically saying the insurance company is willing to pay those cash flows because they have a very diversified mix of people. Some of them are going to live a long time and they're going to be very costly to the insurance company, but some of them, unfortunately, are not going to live very long. They're going to make their premium payment to the insurance company and then promptly pass away, which means that the insurance company didn't need to pay out very many benefits to them and perhaps maybe not even to their survivors. And so the insurance company and their actuaries have a very good idea of what their average person is going, how long their average person is going to live. And that's gone up in recent years for sure. But they can pool the risks so that the insurance company has a risk that's slightly different than yours. You just don't want to run out of money. The insurance company is actually looking to make money. And so what this allows you to do is transfer some of your very idiosyncratic risk to an insurance company who has a much more broadly diversified set of risks than your unique risk of running out of money. And so Wade goes on. He says, the annuity puzzle relates to why commercial annuities aren't used more frequently. As far back as the 1920s, Wharton professor Solomon Hubner wrote something along the lines of, why are people just investing in bonds and spending the interest when they could be using an annuity that would allow them a much higher level of spending than bonds would provide? The solution to the puzzle may simply be that they do use annuities. Social Security is an annuity, and the typical American doesn't have a lot of investment assets. Social Security may already provide plenty of annuity income. There's no need to go to the commercial annuity markets beyond that. And I could see that. For a lot of retirees, they don't have sufficient capital to turn over a chunk of their portfolio to an annuity company or an insurance company and still have a lot left over, and they may not be comfortable with foregoing that much of their principal. And what I mean by that is they might want a little bit more optionality supplemented by Social Security, which is already kind of an annuity. And it's not an annuity because it's guaranteed by the United States government. It's separate, but it functions much like an annuity. And they might be thinking, I've got my Social Security. I don't also need to layer another annuity on top of that. That's a fair point. And then Christine says, one other big knock at annuities is that inflation can eat away at the purchasing power of the income you receive. And adding an inflation rider can be very expensive. Should that lack of inflation protection be a big obstacle for people who would otherwise be inclined toward an income-producing product like an annuity? And then what Wade says is there are no annuities that are offering just a basic cost of living adjustment free from an income adjustment rider. And a rider would be essentially another product that you're putting on top of your annuity that would give you that income adjustment subject to some measure of inflation, CPI being the most common. So what he's saying is there's no plain vanilla annuity that offers that right now. For the benefit of the listener, Social Security does offer cost of living adjustments tied to a measure of inflation. But Wade's point is you don't use the annuity for inflation protection. You use it for the risk pooled protected lifetime income that's not inflation adjusted. Now, you could add a cost of living adjustment, but that doesn't provide inflation protection higher than whatever cost of living adjustments you included. So you don't have protection against unexpectedly high rates of inflation. But the annuity can allow you to meet more expenses over time from a given premium or given asset base than a traditional like TIPS, security, or bond. And so Wade's point is saying, if you're thinking about your annuity in terms of how it will protect you from inflation, you're already in the wrong context. Your other assets, stocks, those are really going to be your protection against inflation because operating companies have assets, and assets tend to rise in value during inflation. This is why your primary residence tends to be a pretty good hedge against inflation because as asset values are increasing across the board, so too is your home. Obviously, the location of the home, that would matter a whole lot, but theoretically, as asset valuations are inflating, operating companies, stocks, those tend to have assets, and those asset valuations are going to rise right along with it, which is why stocks have tended to be a pretty good inflation hedge, and so is real estate. Some people argue gold has done the same thing, but if you think about gold, it's just an asset. So your annuity is not there to function as a protection against inflation. Your other assets are, namely your stocks. Your annuity is literally hired to do one thing, to provide you an income stream for the rest of your life and not have it put your other assets at risk. So you're transferring that risk to a third party. They could very well default. That's certainly possible. It's just not likely. But that's why you're buying the annuity. So don't think about it in terms of inflation adjustments because you've got other assets to address that risk. Wade goes on. He says, if I'm thinking about stocks and bonds versus if you think about stocks and bonds versus stocks and income annuities, the income annuity allows me to meet more of my expenses than bonds, which then puts less pressure on the stocks for distributions. When you're putting less pressure on stocks for distributions, you have less sequence risk for the stocks and more potential for growth. Over time, we do tend to expect stocks to keep up with inflation, not necessarily over short periods, but over long periods. So that's just reiterating exactly what we talked about before. You couple an annuity with more aggressive positioning in your portfolio. That part of your portfolio, the stocks, is really going to provide you the hedge against inflation, and that's really going to provide you with the additional discretionary spending over and above what the annuity is going to provide you. However, you won't be putting pressure on the stock part of your portfolio during market down years because you just probably won't be doing quite as much discretionary spending above what your annuity and your Social Security would be providing you. Okay. That kind of was a wrap on that investment style. So retirement income style 4 is called a risk wrap. And Christine says, risk wrap is another of the hybrid sorts of styles like time segmentation. Can you talk about what this entails? Wade says, risk wrap is another behavioral strategy. With risk wrap, you're probability based, so you're more comfortable relying on the market, but you've also got a commitment orientation and you're comfortable committing to a strategy. So you're kind of a mix here. If you have these orientations, you also tend to be a little bit more worried about outliving your money. It's like you want to put some sort of guardrail around your market risk. The more natural approach would be to use a simple income annuity and then invest the rest in the stock market. But risk wrap is a behavioral approach. There are a lot of options here, but the simplest way is a variable annuity with a lifetime income benefit. So, variable annuity, it's a way for you to get an annuity-like exposure. However, the assets that you put into this variable annuity are going to be sensitive to the market. So, the variable annuity lets you invest for upside. And if the markets do well, you get a step up. You get step-up opportunities and so forth. So what he means by step-up opportunities is the base upon which you could draw that lifetime income is going to go up if the market goes up in many of these products. But you have this lifetime income benefit so that no matter what happens, no matter how the markets fall, causing you to deplete the value of that annuity, that still triggers this lifetime income benefit. And so you have protected a lifetime income. So what it's saying is, for many of these variable annuities, you get some market gyrations over time, and those tend to, over sufficient length of time, be up, right? And so what that variable annuity allows you to do is to participate in that market as it's going up and locking in higher and higher bases upon which you could then draw your guaranteed income. Now, what Wade is saying here, and this isn't true of every product, but in many products, once that higher income base has been achieved, many annuity companies will provide a sort of lock, saying, yep, you've hit this high water mark. If you want to start drawing a lifetime income stream, you can pull it off of that base, even if the market goes down after you have locked in. Okay. Now, in order to lock in, you might actually have to start taking that income stream. So if you leave that open-ended, they might say, yeah, you can leave it open-ended, but it might go down again. It will really depend on the various idiosyncrasies of the product that you've got. But many of them do provide that high watermark lock, which would allow you to essentially secure a higher stream of income if you were willing to take the risk on the front end in the variable annuity. Christine says, this is an area that a lot of serious financial practitioners look down on. There's a lack of transparency with a lot of these products, and they can be a very high cost. Do you think that it's unreasonable for advisors to automatically say these products are totally off the table? And Wade says, I don't think it's unreasonable to have a fundamental unwillingness to look at the products. I personally am risk wrap oriented, so I've spent more time looking at these types of financial products. You do have the ability to invest quite aggressively, even if the stock market goes down. That triggers the benefit. You have this protected lifetime income, and there are low-cost versions. There are even fee-only versions. A low-cost variable annuity with upside growth potential can be a powerful way to build a retirement strategy. But it's going to appeal more to people who have that probability-based mindset, because generally the variable annuities will have lower downside guarantees, and in the worst-case scenario, you won't get as much protected lifetime income. So I think what Wade is saying is you should keep an open mind about variable annuities, but it's kind of an unusual hybrid cat, so to speak, who is going to be willing to buy one of these products because they're sort of two minds. They want to take market risk with their assets, but they want some kind of underlying promise that maybe at some point in time they'll have sufficient accumulation and they want to lock in on a number and take a lifetime income stream off of that number. So it's kind of a hybrid mindset here where you don't want to go single premium, immediate, fixed annuity, plain vanilla, but you also don't want to be taking all the risk all the time with just your assets. And this is kind of halfway. Now, Variable annuities, they can be expensive. They can have very high internal costs. They can pay very prodigious commissions. So much like with any other financial product, if you're working with a practitioner, you should have a very clear sense as to why you own what you own, where it plays into your strategy, how much it costs you per year, and what the performance of that product has been net of the fees. And with an annuity, the performance of a product is a little bit more difficult to assess because a huge part of that is that guaranteed lifetime income stream, which is very hard to value. And it's not hard to value quantitatively. You could just do a discounted cash flow, find the present value of that lifetime stream of income if you knew exactly how long you were going to live. I think it's hard to value because it's hard to say how much better you might feel about your retirement if you had that lifetime income stream. And I admittedly don't know how to put a number on that. Okay. So she says, as a bit in closing, you mentioned that risk wrap is your own orientation. So that's how Wade feels about his assets. What do you find appealing about it? And so Wade says, I'm very comfortable relying on the stock market, but I don't assume a high rate of return. I'll be very heavily invested in stocks, but I'm going to assume a rate of return closer to the bond side. I do like having the protections in place. The protections of the annuity living benefit mean that even if the stocks don't do well, I can still calculate the worst case scenario for my financial plan, unlike with a pure investment approach. And that's another opportunity that you have with an annuity, is it essentially is going to reduce the range of possible outcomes for ending wealth or for your retirement. It's saying, yeah, you're probably not going to leave an estate of $50 million by taking this strategy on, but it's very unlikely that you're going to run out of money prior to when you run out of time. And that's what I think most people are concerned with. They don't really care how high the ceiling is. They really just want to get a sense of where the floor is. And I think what Wade is saying is, if a person is willing to entertain using an annuity, they can really solidify that floor. That a person can feel really grounded on that, saying, yep, got my Social Security, I've got maybe the interest that my bonds are paying, and I've got this annuity income. My lifestyle is pretty well funded at that point in time. And as we've talked about before, that allows them to do slightly other things with their money that they might otherwise not have done, which could ultimately result in slightly more end of period wealth than if they had taken all the risk all the time with their own money, subject to sequence risk and all the other constraints. So that was How to Retire with Wade Pfau. Again, it came across as a lot of annuity talk, but Wade's pretty into this kind of stuff. Like I said, he's written some books of his own where you can get more information on that. But wherever you're listening or watching this, please like and subscribe and stay tuned for the next installment.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Personal Finance Project. This show would not exist without the help of our brilliant creative director, Kira Minifield. Kira, thank you for everything you do to keep this show running. On to the disclosures.
Variable annuities are sold by prospectus only and may be obtained from your financial advisor or the fund website. Before purchasing a variable annuity, you should carefully read the prospectus and consider the annuity's investment objectives and all risks, charges, and expenses associated with the annuity and its investment options. This should be read carefully before investing. Annuities carry unique risk, including market risk, investment risk, and claims-paying abilities of the insurer. There may also be instances where a contract will pay out less than the premiums paid or expire within the lifetime of the insured. There may be penalties for early withdrawal, and they are not insured by the FDIC because they are insurance, not an investment. Guaranteed income is dependent on the claims-paying ability of the issuing company. Variable annuities are long-term investments intended for retirement planning and involve market risk and the possible loss of principal. Any withdrawals prior to 59.5 may be subject to income tax and a 10% federal tax penalty. Investments in variable annuities are subject to fees and charges from the insurance company and the investment managers.
This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. Investors should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of a fund carefully before investing. This and other information is found in the prospectus and summary prospectus. For a prospectus, please contact your financial professional and read it carefully before investing. Annuities carry unique risks, including market risk, investment risk, and claims-paying abilities of the insurer. There may also be instances where a contract will pay out less than the premiums paid or expire within the lifetime of the insured. There may be penalties for early withdrawal, and they are not insured by the FDIC because they are insurance, not an investment. Investors should consider carefully information contained in the prospectus or, if available, the summary prospectus, including investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. You can request a prospectus by reaching out to your financial advisor. Please read the prospectus carefully before investing. Investment returns will fluctuate and are subject to market volatility, so that an investor's shares, when redeemed or sold, may be worth more or less than their original cost. Unlike mutual funds, shares of ETFs are not individually redeemable directly with the ETF. Shares of ETFs are bought and sold at market price, which may be higher or lower than the net asset value, NAV. Baird does not issue or underwrite mortgages and does not service mortgage lending services. Any references to mortgages in the financial services offerings are purely intended to convey an engagement in this holistic planning process, with this as one piece of the larger picture, which may or may not apply to all clients. This broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co., Incorporated.